Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I first spotted the listing in a local Facebook group, buried between overpriced studio apartments and ambiguous rooms for rent. The photos looked promising: freshly painted walls, newly installed hardwood floors, and a neat little backyard. The rent was way below average for my city, which should have been my first red flag. But I was desperate to find a place closer to my new job. At that point, saving money mattered more to me than investigating why the listing seemed too good to be true. When I arranged a viewing, the landlord, Ms. Karen, and yes, that was her actual first name, seemed overly enthusiastic about having me move in. She was a middle-aged woman with an unnerving, wide-eyed smile that never seemed to waver. She proudly showed me around the property, pointing out the brand-new appliances and the cozy personal touches she'd added. She even bragged about how she lived right next door, in the unit with the adjoining backyard. I didn't think too hard about what that meant for my personal space at the time. Instead, I was just excited to see the convenient layout and how pristine everything looked. Ms. Karen was eager to seal the deal. She offered to waive the deposit if I could move in immediately. She even handed me a welcome to your new home kit filled with scented candles, a binder of local takeout menus, and a thick packet of house rules. I skimmed the packet, spotting a few oddities, like a strongly worded paragraph about excessive use of cooking spices being prohibited, but I chalked it up to her just being particular about cleanliness. My gut nagged at me, but I reasoned that every landlord had quirks. At least she was transparent, right? The first few days went smoothly. I settled in, unpacked my belongings, and even lit one of the candles Ms. Karen had gifted me. By the end of the week, I noticed two interesting developments. 1. Ms. Karen popped by nearly every evening just to check in, bringing everything from homemade cookies to random pamphlets on local events. 2. She mentioned that since the lease included a maintenance clause, she was allowed to do a brief walkthrough of the rental each week to ensure everything was in order. I'd never heard of a landlord conducting weekly inspections, but she insisted it was standard procedure in her properties, for the peace of mind of everyone involved. During the first walkthrough, Ms. Karen didn't even knock. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard her key in the lock. She strolled right in, greeted me with her usual unblinking grin, and started poking around, opening cabinets, examining the thermostat, even lifting throw pillows off my couch to look underneath. I stood there in disbelief, clutching my mug. When I mustered the courage to ask her to at least schedule a time or knock, she brushed me off with a little laugh. "Honey, I own this place," she said, "and I have to make sure it's in tip-top shape." She left me with a pamphlet on home safety and an uneasy feeling churning in my stomach. Over the next week, Ms. Karen's visits became more frequent. She arrived at odd hours, sometimes after 8 p.m., always letting herself in without prior notice. Once, I came home from work to find her rearranging my living room furniture. "Feng shui," she explained, beaming at me as if I should be grateful she was improving the energy flow. Another time, she knocked on the bathroom door while I was showering, claiming she heard a strange noise and wanted to make sure there wasn't a plumbing issue. Yet, every time I tried to express discomfort, she'd wave me off, saying things like, "Oh, sweetheart, I'm just trying to keep our property perfect." Things escalated further when she took issue with my cooking. I love spicy food, and apparently the aromas drifted into the hallway. One night, she pounded on my door, complaining that the smell of my curry was disturbingly pungent and might stain her new walls. She then demanded that I refrain from cooking anything too aromatic, under threat of charging me a fumigation fee. Her house rules packet suddenly made more sense, but it was still alarming to have someone policing my meal prep. When I reminded her that cooking was an essential part of living, she simply crossed her arms and declared, "If you can't handle my rules, maybe this isn't the place for you." This standoff came to a head on a Tuesday evening when I invited a close friend over for dinner. About 15 minutes into our meal, Ms. Karen barged in, outraged that I had a guest without proper clearance. She claimed it was for security reasons and insisted she had to approve all visitors beforehand. My friend and I exchanged looks of baffled shock. When I protested that this was my private living space and I didn't need her permission to have guests, Ms. Karen's face hardened. Her smile vanished for the first time, replaced by a cold glare. She warned me that I was violating my lease agreement and that if I continued down this path, I'd be in for serious consequences. That night, I lay awake, heart pounding. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, but it felt like I was living under surveillance. As I replayed Ms. Karen's threats in my mind, I realized something had to give. Little did I know, her strange behavior was only the beginning, and I was about to learn just how far she was willing to go to enforce her so-called rules. I decided to take a more proactive approach the next day. After work, I sat down with my lease to see if Ms. Karen had any legal grounds to justify her intrusions. Although the document did mention periodic inspections, it made no reference to multiple unannounced visits per week. There was also a vague clause about maintaining peaceful conditions, but nothing about needing approval for visitors or banning certain types of cuisine. Feeling emboldened, I typed up a polite but firm email outlining my concerns, her constant drop-ins, the invasion of privacy, and the unrealistic rules about cooking. I asked her to respond in writing. Her reply, which arrived barely an hour later, was a strange combination of sugar-coated pleasantries and veiled threats. She thanked me for my feedback but insisted she knew best how to maintain her property. She also claimed that undisclosed guests and unapproved odors could void the lease at her discretion. By then, I'd done enough research to suspect she was bluffing. Still, the menacing tone of her message rattled me. I forwarded the email to my friend who worked part-time at a law firm, asking for her take. She responded with an all-caps "This is not normal" and advised me to consider contacting a tenant advocacy group. Just as I was contemplating my next move, Ms. Karen escalated things further. Late one evening, while I was unwinding with a movie, she began pounding on my door. When I opened it, she marched in and started ranting about a noise complaint. I was certain my volume was at a reasonable level, but she insisted someone had called her to complain. "Who called you?" I asked, confused. We lived in a duplex, and the other unit was vacant. She just shook her head and said, "That's none of your business, dear. But keep it up, and I'll have to involve the authorities." She left in a huff, leaving me staring at the door, speechless. A few days later, she made good on her promise. I'd invited my cousin over to help me fix a leaky faucet, which Ms. Karen had refused to address, claiming it was my responsibility. While we were working in the kitchen, we heard the front door handle jiggle. This time, I'd had the foresight to deadbolt the door. Ms. Karen began shouting from the other side, demanding to be let in. My cousin, who had a no-nonsense attitude, told her to come back later. Instead, we heard Ms. Karen shout, "Fine. We'll do this the hard way." Not 5 minutes later, there was the sound of sirens, followed by a knock at the door. 2 police officers stood on my doorstep, looking puzzled. One officer asked if everything was all right. Ms. Karen, wearing an exaggerated expression of concern, claimed she had heard screaming and feared for her tenant's safety. I was furious but tried to remain calm, explaining to the officers that we were simply fixing a faucet. My cousin backed me up, telling them Ms. Karen was harassing us. The officers seemed to realize quickly that this was a case of a landlord calling them for a non-issue. They asked Ms. Karen to step outside while they took my statement. After hearing my account and seeing no evidence of any disturbance, they told Ms. Karen that this was a civil matter and suggested she handle any real disputes through formal channels, not emergency calls. Before leaving, one of the officers gave me a sympathetic shrug, muttering something about landlord-tenant disputes being messy. I could tell Ms. Karen was livid at being brushed off. She glared at me as the officers drove away, muttering under her breath about how no one respects property owners anymore. That night, I got a barrage of emails from her, each one more aggressive than the last. She threatened me with eviction, implying I was a dangerous tenant and a liability to her property. She repeated the lie that I'd been screaming inside the house, and claimed she had every right to request a police wellness check. If I didn't like it, she said, I could leave. My friend at the law firm finally connected me with a tenant advocacy hotline. They advised me to keep track of all incidents, every email, text, and unannounced visit. They also suggested sending Ms. Karen a certified letter citing the local tenancy laws that protected my right to quiet enjoyment of the property. Emboldened, I drafted a formal complaint outlining every intrusion and intimidation tactic Ms. Karen had pulled. I sent it via certified mail and also emailed her a copy. The next evening, when she attempted another inspection, I met her at the door with a brand new chain lock in place. I politely but firmly handed her the letter from the advocacy group, stating that all further communications should be in writing. She looked flabbergasted. For a few days, I got a break from the chaos. No visits, no frantic emails, not even a scowl through the window. I let myself hope Ms. Karen had finally realized I wasn't going to be pushed around. But that small reprieve turned out to be the calm before the storm. She was gearing up for a far bigger showdown, a showdown that would land both of us in front of a judge, all because she couldn't stand a tenant who dared to enforce their legal rights. The final escalation began with a letter slipped under my door, a formal notice to vacate. Ms. Karen claimed I had violated the lease on multiple counts: unauthorized guests, excessive noise, and general uncooperative behavior. I stared at the letter in disbelief. While I understood that landlords could issue notices for legitimate breaches, this laundry list of complaints was nothing but exaggerations or outright lies. My cousin's visit to fix a faucet hardly constituted a major violation, and my so-called excessive noise had never been substantiated, even by the police she herself had called. Furious, I reached out to the tenant advocacy group again. They informed me that, in my city, a landlord must have a valid reason to evict a tenant before the end of the lease term, especially if it was a fixed lease and not month-to-month. Ms. Karen's claims didn't meet the legal threshold for eviction. Loud cooking smells and a single guest helping with repairs weren't legitimate grounds. They suggested I prepare to dispute the notice in court if she proceeded. A week later, I received a summons. Ms. Karen was indeed taking me to court, alleging damages and breach of contract. She wanted me out, and she wanted me to pay for damages I had supposedly caused. The list included absurd items like spice residue on walls, emotional distress from disrespectful tenant, and loss of property value due to negative aura. Yes, she actually wrote negative aura in a legal document. My jaw dropped so hard I nearly laughed, but the looming court date wiped away any amusement. This was serious, and if I lost, I'd not only be forced out but could be on the hook for thousands of dollars in bogus fees. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Ms. Karen intensified her harassment. She started sending me daily emails demanding to know when I would abandon the premises. She threatened to change the locks, though that was clearly illegal without a proper court order. At one point, she posted a handmade sign in the front yard reading, "Tenant on notice, vacate now," which the mailman chuckled about but still left me mortified in front of the neighbors. It was embarrassing, stressful, and completely surreal. I focused on building my case. I compiled every email and text exchange that contradicted her claims, highlighting her harassment and the repeated instances of unlawful entry. I gathered notes on each police visit, complete with the officers' names and the official incident numbers. My cousin agreed to testify, and I even lined up a neighbor from across the street who was willing to state they'd never heard any excessive noise from my unit. By the time my hearing date rolled around, I had an organized binder full of evidence that painted Ms. Karen as a meddling landlord who had crossed multiple legal lines. Walking into the small claims courtroom, my stomach churned with nerves. Ms. Karen was already seated, flipping through a stack of papers. She didn't acknowledge me, but I could see the corners of her mouth turn downward when she noticed the thick binder in my hands. When the judge called our case, Ms. Karen launched into an impassioned speech about how I had terrorized her property with loud music, suspicious visitors, and strong foreign smells. She claimed she had chronic headaches from my cooking and emotional trauma from my aggressive demeanor. At one point, she even tried to pass off some random paint chips as evidence of the damage I'd caused. The judge raised an eyebrow but let her finish. When it was my turn, I calmly presented the timeline of events, emphasizing how Ms. Karen frequently entered without proper notice, harassed me with late-night visits, and made unfounded police calls. I showed copies of her emails threatening eviction over trivial issues. I also read aloud the city's tenant rights statutes, which explicitly state a landlord must give written notice before entering. The judge seemed particularly annoyed by the repeated unannounced entries and Ms. Karen's documented threats. Ms. Karen tried to interrupt multiple times, but the judge silenced her with a firm wave. In the end, the judge not only dismissed her eviction claim but also rebuked Ms. Karen for abusing the legal system. I was awarded compensation for my legal fees and partial reimbursement for the emotional distress. While it wasn't a massive sum of money, it felt like validation, a symbolic victory that proved I wasn't the one in the wrong. After the hearing, Ms. Karen cornered me in the hallway, her face red with anger. She spat out something about ungrateful tenants ruining her life. I quickly walked away, adrenaline still pumping. The next day, I started looking for a new place. Even though the judge had allowed me to remain until the end of my lease, I couldn't bear living next door to someone who despised me so intensely. My security deposit, thankfully, was intact, and with the settlement money, I had enough to find a better apartment, somewhere I could truly have peace of mind. When I finally moved out, I felt a surge of relief. I left the keys in Ms. Karen's mailbox and didn't bother with a goodbye. The chapter of dealing with a Karen landlord had been one of the most stressful experiences of my life. Yet, it taught me a valuable lesson about knowing my rights and standing up for them. No fancy backyard or freshly painted walls are worth sacrificing your privacy and sanity. And if a rental listing seems too good to be true, there's often a very disturbing reason behind it.